to ChangeMakers. Thank you. New to ChangeMakers on Tuesdays, welcome. I'm Matthew Cox. I'm one of the conveners or co-conveners of the Australia Together group. And for the last few months, we've been giving ChangeMakers on Tuesdays a go as a way of getting people all around the country who are interested in place-based work and in social change work and just doing interesting things together to share notes and learn from each other. So welcome everybody. We'll start as we always do by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on all around the country. I'm in Brisbane, so I'm on Turrbal land. And if you like, you can drop an acknowledgement in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. Now, ChangeMakers on Tuesdays is brought to you by the Australia Together Alliance and with some financial support that makes it possible from DSS, our partners in the federal government, and CFI does all the technical support, and the wonderful Michelle, who many of you will know, keeps the whole thing running and plays the girl from Ipanema at the beginning every session. Now, our guest speaker this month is the very wonderful Laurie Rubinstein. Laurie is convening something called the Brain Builders Alliance. And Laurie, you're a visiting fellow with the RACI, is that right? Tell us about the Brain Builders Alliance.
Yep, principal advisor and director of the Brain Builders Alliance. And what it is, it's an initiative that we created in 2020. That's when it started. And it's really about using advances in science, but particularly neuroscience, to build the capabilities that we need to thrive. We know that the situation we face in Australia is that far too many of our kids, young children, are not thriving. We all know the statistics about kids coming to school unprepared to learn. We also know that too many of our adolescents are struggling and falling off the rails. In addition, a lot of our parents are so overburdened that they're really struggling with trying to nurture and support the development of their children. And all of that comes together to sort of lead to growing inequalities and a situation that has negative consequences for all of us. If kids don't thrive, they don't do well in school, they don't learn how to control their behavior and all of those other things, it affects all of us, and all of us pay a price for it. So one of the things I think it's important to understand, when I started looking at this and looking at the neuroscience, I got really excited because the neuroscience does give us hints, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute, about where to go with this and how we can use it. But I also think we need to understand why it's been so difficult to make progress in improving outcomes for kids, especially those kids living with significant disadvantage. We are just not moving the dial. Even though it's been on the national agenda for a long time, we're still not moving the dial. So I started thinking about this question that came up in a paper I saw not too long ago about what holds the problem in place. So for me, it really got me to start thinking about, well, why? Why haven't we made more progress? What's wrong? And I think there are a lot of things, and I'm just going to mention them very quickly. Really poor policymaking processes in Australia, the political necessities that influence how decisions are made and policies developed, et cetera. In the early year space in particular, as well as in working with adolescents, there's fragmentation of effort. There are so many different frameworks and so many different strategies and so many different models that nothing comes together and it's not aligned. And I think that's part of what's keeping us from making more progress. We have silos everywhere. We have silos within sectors. We have silos across sectors. And that's something that's been part of the conversation in Australia, as well as other countries I've worked in for decades. This isn't a new thing. We've talked about it for a very long time. There's also a lack of a common language that we can use across sectors in order to talk with each other more easily. And a seeming inability to close the gap between science and what we actually do. So we know a lot more about evidence and science about early childhood development and about adolescent development more recently, but we're not turning that into policies, programs, and practices. So, and I think that COVID has just exacerbated everything. I mean, we all know that. One of the things that's really struck me about COVID is that I think a lot of families have experienced ongoing toxic stress in a way they never have before. So there's a growing understanding and awareness, if you will, about what happens when you have ongoing stress in your life, particularly in the lives of young children, but also in the lives of adolescents. I think we're seeing now this just explosion of concern about adolescent mental health, for example, as well as mental health of young children.
Laura, I want to dig into the neuroscience a little bit more. A couple of people have just joined us. So our guest speaker this month is Laurie Rubinstein, who's the director of the intriguing thing called the Brain Builders Alliance. We're about to hear a little bit more about what the hell the Brain Builders Alliance is. It's also worth saying, I think daylight saving has cut in half our normal camaraderie, and I think a whole lot of people are going to join this call in about an hour. So we'll fix that up in terms of invitations for next month. But you're listening to Laurie Rubinstein, who's the director of the Brain Builders Alliance. Laurie, let's go to the neuroscience.
Yep.
Why in particular what do we know about the neuroscience, and why is it more important than we might have first thought?
Okay, I usually don't do this, but can I start by just one quotation, which I will read. It's from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Many of you are probably familiar with them and their work. And this really caught my attention when I first read it. Recent advances in the science of brain development offer us unprecedented opportunity to solve some of society's most challenging problems, from widening disparities in school achievement and economic productivity to costly health problems across the lifespan. Understanding how the experiences children have starting at birth and even prenatally affect lifelong outcomes, combined with new knowledge about the adolescent brain, the core capabilities adults need to thrive as parents and in the workforce, provides us with a strong foundation upon which policymakers and civic leaders can design a shared and effective agenda. That's what really got me started in looking at the neuroscience in detail. So what do we know? First, let me say that we know a lot more about the early years, about early brain development and building basic brain architecture, but there is an exploding amount of knowledge about adolescent brain development as the kind of second window of opportunity, as many people put it. So what do we know? Number one, we know that there's a set of brain-based skills or capabilities that everyone needs to thrive: kids, adolescents, and their parents and adults. And these skills aren't innate. People don't come into the world with them. They are developed, and they're developed through experiences and relationships. So that's number one. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second one that's really important too is that brains are built from the bottom up. And that is why people emphasize what happens in the first 1,000 days, for example, is so crucial. Because everything we do, it builds on and on. If we miss a stage, it's much more difficult to kind of come back and resurrect that bit of the architecture. Brains continue to grow, to adapt and change across the lifespan. So they don't stop changing in adolescence. They continue to change, so that it means that the adults, we need to pay attention to the capabilities, brain-based capabilities adults have, because they're nurturing the next generation. The cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities are all intermingled. They all work together. So we can't just focus on cognitive skills and forget about the social, or say social and emotional is important, but cognitive will come later. They all need to be a focus of brain development. The other thing is, and I've been asked this quite a few times, why focus on the brains? What about the body? Well, I'm not talking just about brains, because brains and bodies are clearly interdependent. And I guess one of my favorite metaphors is that it's very much like a team of skilled athletes. They all have their purposes. Our neurological system does something, our cardiovascular system is responsible for something else, et cetera, but they all work in concert. So it's not just about brains, it's about brains and bodies. The other thing that works together is genes and experience. We know from neuroscience that yes, we do come into the world. We're not blank slates. We do come in with a genetic history. We come in with epigenetic history, and that does make a difference. But the most important part is the experiences we have and the relationships we have, because it's within that crucible of experience and relationships, usually with the parents or primary caregivers, that determine how genes are expressed and what actually becomes part of the core story. Responsive caregiving, there's nothing more important than responsive caregiving in terms of helping build strong brains and strong bodies. I remember reading quite some time ago that no matter what a child experiences in life, no matter how many ACEs or other adversities or whatever, as long as there is one person in their life that is absolutely, and this is the language they use, crazy about that child, that can make all the difference. So, it's something, one of the beauties I think about neuroscience is that these are things we can all do. We don't have to be neuroscientists to talk to our babies. We don't have to be neuroscientists to,
I remember listening to Mem Fox on this point, Laurie, and I should add, if you've got a question for Laurie, please drop it in the chat, and she's very happy to take questions and address it. So as we always do, just drop a question in the chat and we'll come to you. But I remember hearing Mem Fox on this topic, and she gave a really beautifully simple explanation. She said something like, we're all born with about the same number of neurons, across the world. And the neurons are like the zeros, and the synapses that connect the neurons are like the ones. And the synapses, the growth of synapses is what gives you brain power. And you grow those synapses by positive stimulation, like reading. And she then went on to give an explanation about why reading is so important, indeed, in utero forward. Is it as simple as that? It's a lovely, simple analogy that it's about growing brain power through, kind exposure. Is it as simple as that? Because I think you wrote a paper called Love Grows Brains, didn't you?
Yes, I did, for an organization with which you were previously attached. Yeah, I did write that paper, and that was the point of it, is that it's your experiences and your relationships and the responsiveness of relationships that makes all the difference. That it's within that kind of crucible of those experiences that we actually develop all those synapses. And I'm going to jump ahead to something I thought I might mention later. Some of you, or maybe all of you, have seen the wonderful TED Talk by Molly, the 7-year-old, who talked about how peekaboo can change the world. And that's exactly what this is about, what Matthew was just talking about. It's about playing peekaboo. And why is peekaboo so important? I mean, we all play it with babies, and they all love it, and they laugh and they giggle and things happen, because it's responsiveness. And there's something about that give and take, or as some people call it, the serve and return, using the tennis metaphor, that's at the heart of it. And every parent can do it. Every caregiver can do it. Now,
and Laurie, someone told me that a child's or baby's focal distance when they're born is about 40 centimeters. They have no focal range beyond 40 centimeters, and that's because that's about the distance from when you're holding a child, your face to the child. Again, that sounds too beautiful and simple to be true, but is it true?
Yeah, no, it is true. I mean, babies initially focus, their distance is about breastfeeding distance, if you will. I mean, and we all know why. I mean, that's the critical relationship, the critical thing babies need to do is connect with someone who's going to nurture or to provide their nutrition. So yes, that certainly is part of it. And I think that when people understand how brains develop, what brain architecture is, how it grows and develops, it's very empowering. It's empowering for parents because they can do lots of things that don't cost money. They don't need special training. They maybe need a few insights and suggestions and hints. And And it's also very empowering for those professionals who work with kids, adolescents, and families, because understanding the core story that a person you're working with, whether it's a child or an adolescent or an adult, understanding their core story gives you a way of empathizing and dealing with them in a very different way than we're often used to. So I think that kind of, that there's so many things we can do. I mean, I think a lot of parents, and we know this from Australian research, feel like they feel a bit unsettled about their parenting abilities. They're not quite sure that they know what to do or they know how to do it. Some of this stuff is really easy to apply. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. The other thing I'll say about that is that it also provides a common language for everyone to talk about. I mean, we all have brains. It's relevant to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're interested in juvenile justice or economic development or early years development or child protection. We all share something important here, and we can begin to talk about it across sectors and try to use it as a way of aligning what we're doing towards the goal of helping all kids develop those core capabilities. It gives us something concrete that's kind of a universal goal that we're after. And then we can develop all the different strategies we need to help different populations and places get to that goal.
Michelle's dropped the TED Talk with this incredible 7-year-old Molly right in the chat. We did on a previous ChangeMakers try and play the video. We got about halfway through it before the internet killed it. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a great view, just a really lovely piece organised by the Thrive by 5 campaign. So check that out. Laurie, tell us about the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, because it's taken all the concepts you're talking about and it's delivered it at a province-wide sort of scale, hasn't it, in Canada?
It has in Canada. My near northern neighbors, I'm from the northwest of the States. Yeah, what they did, they've been going for about 10 years. And luckily for them, they have been backed by a deep pocket philanthropy. So they've spent a lot of money over 10 years developing what they've developed. What they started with was convening neuroscientists from around the world. Most of them were from the US and some from Canada, bringing them together to talk to people about what is it we're learning? What do we know? And from that, they began to develop this online course. And I don't know if any of you have done it or have seen it. It's takes quite a bit of time. It's a bit of a slog, but what they've done is they've taken all that brain power from all those neuroscientists and put it together in this is what we know about brain development. Now, their particular focus when they started was substance abuse and addiction. They felt that professionals felt they just weren't doing a very good job with substance abuse and addiction. So they used the neuroscience as a way in to improving that service or those services, and then it kind of spread. And a couple of things that they have learned from their 10 years of experience is that that notion of empowerment, that has come out really strongly in terms of the professionals who take the course, and now it's required across an awful lot of government departments that people working with children and families have to be neuroscience accredited through the Brain Story course. They think it's that important. So it's been a really important, I think, step forward. It's the first of its kind that we know of anyway that's been developed. And what we're doing in Australia, I think, is trying to build on what they've started with. And this sounds a little overblown, but make it better, make it more dynamic, make it Australian. We have certain kinds of attitudes and beliefs in Australia, and they may be different than Canada. Every place is a bit different. And after talking with people for the last 18 months, it's become clear to me that we want to develop our own Indigenous brain story course, if you will. And there's some other bits, and Matthew, maybe I'll let you ask another question rather than just rabbiting on. But in addition to neuroscience, there are a couple of other bits I thought I'd mention. But
well, we're almost out of time, Laurie. I think probably it'd be great to let people know what's happening with the Brain Builders Alliance, and particularly if you want to get involved or get more info, how people can take a step to get involved.
Look, you can contact me at Ramsey. And one of the things I'll just mention quickly is we're particularly working with Thriving Queensland Kids Alliance, our partnership, sorry, because we can develop materials, we can develop ideas, et cetera, but they need to be tested, trialed, and implemented. And so Queensland, Thriving Queensland Kids, has brought together so many people from across so many different sectors and interests that it provides us with an absolutely fabulous implementation trialing, so that we can work with government departments as well as NGOs and others, academic institutions, to try to figure out what's the best way to help people understand the neuroscience and to apply it. It's not just the understanding, obviously. One thing Brain Builders is really concerned about is, okay, after you've learned this body of knowledge, how do you apply it? So we're thinking about developing communities of practice around it, and that's something that we will be trialing in Queensland.
Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. Michelle's dropped one of the papers that you've developed around the Brain Builders Alliance in the chat, so people can check that out. I'm sure you won't mind if we might drop your email in the chat, and if people wanted to make contact with you and take some further steps. But the neuroscience has really come on, hasn't it, in the last 10 years, and it's a major strategy for us all in terms of dealing with trauma and early child development, adolescent development. It's really one of the, there aren't many master issues in the work that we all do, but it's close to one of them, isn't it?
Absolutely. And let me just add one or two things. And that is that when I was talking about what do we know from brain science, one of the things we know is that stress, ongoing stress in particular, damages developing brains. It doesn't mean they're damaged forever, but it does have an impact. And that's something I think we really do need to pay attention to. The kind of environments in which children are growing up, so that the goal is really about helping all kids thrive, no matter who their parents are or where they grow up. And I think that's really sort of an important, maybe, place to stop.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Get involved with Brain Builders Alliance if that's connected with the sort of work that you do. Check out those resources at Ramsey, and Michelle will drop Laurie's email in the chat and get in touch with Laurie. Thanks so much, Laurie.
Thanks.
Now, what we're going to do is have our regular breakout and catch-up session. Now, we didn't do this last month, and a few people noted that and said they really enjoyed catching up with people in small groups. So we're going to give you about 10 or 15 minutes to meet each other in small groups. Introduce yourself if you don't already know each other. And you might like to talk about a piece of work that you're doing currently. If you get through all of that, what we'd like you to have a think about is topics and guest speakers that you might like to see at a future ChangeMakers on Tuesdays events. So Michelle's going to put you into 2 or 3 breakout groups and give you a chance to say hi to each other. And then, so say hi, talk about any work that you've got on at the moment that you think other people might be interested in. And then if you get through all that, give us some ideas about guest speakers or topics that you might like to think about in the future. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Can you just remind me how long we've got in our breakout groups?
I reckon we've got about 12 minutes.
12 minutes, wonderful. So I'll pop you in groups now. See you all in 12 minutes. Enjoy.
I think we're all back. Michelle, we all back?
We're all back. Good
We're
to
all
go.
back. So I hope you had a chance to meet someone you didn't know, find out something about someone's work that was interesting. Now, Michelle's going to drop Laurie's email address in the chat, so you've got that if you want to follow up on the Brain Builders Alliance. And if anyone did get to the topic of what future topics or speakers you'd like to see, drop that in the chat as well. Or if you just think of something now, drop it in the chat. But now it's time for Drumroll Community of the Month. And this month we're joined by Juan Laranaga, who's once with the Minderoo Foundation, and he's here to tell us about not one but 4 communities that are part of the Early Years Initiative. Welcome, Juan. Great to see you.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay. So, firstly, tell us about the Early Years Initiative.
So the Early Years Initiative is a 10-year partnership between Minderoo Foundation, the WA government, and Telethon Kids as a research partner. And the idea was really around testing and innovating community-led, place-based early years demonstration projects. And it was around looking at how do we do things differently and work differently to support the better improved development, health and learning of children in communities across Australia. WA.
And so there's 4 communities as part of the program. Tell us a little bit about each of those 4.
Sure. So the idea was that we would test 4 distinct communities, knowing that each community is unique. So there was a commitment to have 1 urban, 1 regional, 1 remote, and 1 very remote. So 4 communities. And the work of the Telethon Kids was really looking at what does the evidence tell us about this type of work, and then we use that to kind of create a selection matrix on that would enable us to select the communities. And so there was a process that went behind selecting those communities. So where we got to was around the importance of building on what already exists and looking at those communities that had the right preconditions to enable this work to be successful. And so the Central Great Southern, which is a combination of 4 local government areas in a regional area in the south of WA. So it's 4 townships. So Katanning, Kojonup, Broomhill, Tambalup, and Naranggarup. The urban site was Armidale, which is on the outer fringes of Perth. And it's also quite a large, low socioeconomic community, high portion of Aboriginal communities. And then the remote, which has just come on board, is Derby in the West Kimberley, and the very remote, the largest Aboriginal community in WA, which is Bidjadanga. So very, very diverse, very distinct and unique communities that are engaged in the project.
So just the scale of WA is incredible, isn't it? So Derby and Bidjadanga would be further away from Perth than Brisbane and Perth by a fair margin, and probably Moscow and London, I imagine.
That's right. That's right. And again, you've got the similar to like North Queensland, you've got your climatic challenges as well. So you've got to try and work in with those as well. And I guess the other key point is, in terms of, the importance of kind of being guided by community. So we have a tendency here in WA that everyone tends to head to the Kimberley when the weather's great. So now winter, so it suits us. It's cool, when things are happening. Whereas for those that are living in those communities, it's not always the case. So it's really important that we demonstrate our commitment. And if it means that we have to travel up in the wet season when it's muggy, it's humid, and the conditions are tough, well, that's our commitment, and that's where we demonstrate, why this is such an important project to those communities.
So it's a pretty ambitious project by design. So you're getting the whole of the Western Australian government together, and then partnering with Minderoo and Telethon. So that's an institutional partnership that takes a bit of work. And then all of those people are trying to come in behind local communities. That's pretty much the architecture of it, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, and now we're really excited as well because we've recently partnered with the Commonwealth, which was a kind of a big gap. So again, through Department of Education, Skills and Employment, so the Connect to Beginnings project, that's been a really kind of, again, understanding how do we kind of bring all the resources that are, there to create success in those communities and create that right matrix so that we're all contributing to supporting the capacity building and strengthening of those communities. So whilst the state government's really about leveraging what already investments and activities they're already funding and kind of helping community guide government around redesigning those and reconfiguring those so it actually makes sense to those communities who are receiving those services.
Do you mind me asking just some of those relationships you're trying to stitch together, top to bottom, side to side, government to government? I mean, any one of those is a challenging activity sometimes, as we probably all live out in our work lives, and you're trying to do all of them, all roughly at once. Just talk through some of the, the challenges and the successes of stitching all that together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess when people look at where the project's 3 years in, and when people ask the question, well, what's happened for children? What's happened in those communities as a result of 3 years in? But again, this is, as all of us know, this is really complex work, and the relational piece that you're talking about, that stitching up, is really complex. When you've got mega departments like health and education and child protection all coming together to kind of look at how they're contributing in what way to those communities, but making sense of understanding how do we kind of stitch that up in a way that it actually reflects what the community needs has been a challenge. But also the relational piece around trusting and trying to let go of some of the kind of risk elements that are involved, by putting communities in charge. There's always that risk from government that they're going to ask for something. They're going to ask for something that we can't deliver. And it's not about understanding, well, actually, if you get the right people in community involved, the champions, they know how to manage those expectations. They know how to make sense of the world, and they know that there's more to that than just asking for putting your hand out and asking for more money. It's about being strategic and creating and designing the right service system that their communities are going to need. So a lot of the first few years is really around putting that evidence that Telethon Kids put together into practice, which is a challenge. And then it's about the relationships, building that trust across philanthropy and government, and also across the various government departments as well, in terms of letting go around their silos and trying to understand how they kind of connect with each other and cross over where the communities actually meet the services.
Such a good learning, isn't it? I mean, this sort of work just takes time to build the bridges across, all the institutions of society, the bridges between local communities and the institutions that are there to serve them. It's inherently, all of this is about reform. It's about a big change in the way support happens. And that's what you're buying, isn't it, really, in the first couple of years? That's what you're buying, is the capacity to work differently.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think we had a really good experience during COVID, when obviously the partnership, because of the nature of the disaster, the government put a pause on everything that involved non-emergency kind of responses. Yet we saw this as a really unique opportunity. This is when we should be supporting those communities. And again, even that was a challenge, because well, no, we've got to pause. Well, I mean, yes, government can pause, but this is where the agility of working and partnering with philanthropy actually is really beneficial, because we can continue to support those communities in another way that actually means that we're here for the long haul, and we're here when you guys are doing it tough, whilst it may not necessarily be the project and the initiatives that we actually, and the strategy that we actually were working towards, but actually it's about maintaining that relationship with those communities. And that in itself was really critical to the success. Once, COVID kind of started to kind of get under control and we reinitiated the project, the relationship with those communities was even stronger. That trust with the community was even stronger as a result of that.
And imagine one of the inevitable tensions being a 4-site model. Like a lot of us on the call have been invested in one community or a couple, but a 4-site model, one of the tensions would be standardization versus customization, about local community need, and trying to set up a system that can then support that. How's that going? Are the communities quite different in the plans and the aspirations that they've got?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think some communities are more mature and down the track than others. So Central Great Southern were the first community that was announced, and even that took a bit of time because it actually, there was existing kind of governance structures that were there ready to be built on, and there was a tendency to try and create a new structure, which kind of created some tension within those communities. And then you've got like Bidjadanga, who very remote, very cautious around, again, when you look at other government coming in, research institutions coming in, and it's like, well, hang on, how's this different to what's happened in the past? So, but also acknowledging that they're going to need a lot more support, a lot more dipping in from the project team than some of the other communities that have got a bit more infrastructure and a bit more kind of capability behind them. So again, very, very different communities, very different levels of need, but ideally, the emphasis is around building on what already exists, strengthening the capacity of communities around understanding why the early years is really critical, and also looking at what sort of capacity building do they need and how do we help with that.
Mm. And that trust issue, just about, the great thing about the early years initiative that I can see is you've got this immense capacity of, really major institutions wanting to work together. And that's a huge thing that a lot of community initiatives are killed for. They're killed to have that capability, involved. But it must come with the rub of really a whole lot of trust building required at the local level. I know in my own work in Logan, we used to joke you could walk down the main street in Logan handing out $100 bills and people wouldn't take them. That's what are you doing?
That's right. And I think it's the makeup of the team. I mean, obviously, one of the fortunate advantages of the early years initiative is at the board level, we've got, it's high level decision makers from each of the three major government departments, and having them kind of be the authority that can actually make decisions on the spot, and connect those directly with communities is really been a massive advantage. But again, the understanding and knowing the communities is really critical, and finding the right partners who have got those connections, and I think a lot of work went in behind understanding and getting to know the real kind of change agents in those communities and who've got the relationships, and building into that community rhythm and that relationship rhythm, rather than trying to recreate something ourselves, and so that's been really critical. So really doing our homework, understanding who's in each of those communities who have got authority and connections, and really working hard to build those relationships. And I think that in itself has been really an important piece of this project to ensure success.
We're almost out of time, Juan. Let's ask a question about Minderoo's broader sort of agenda and mission. There's a few things going on in the early childhood space, aren't there? Could just maybe just remind people about how the Minderoo Foundation is structured, because it's got quite a lot of different sort of charitable activity, doesn't it? And then there's quite a big early childhood theme.
Yeah, so Minderoo's, it's quite a ambitious global now philanthropy. There's 11 initiatives, so everything from returning oceans to its natural state, preventing overfishing, modern slavery, addressing modern slavery, curing cancer. So it's really, and then involved in the traditional kind of philanthropic things of arts. In terms of the early years space, it's been 20 years kind of vision for the founders. Like Nicola Forrest, this has been her original kind of area of focus. And the Thrive by 5 has two key program areas. One is around advocating for systems change. So it's obviously there's a national reform agenda around the early childhood system, but also underneath that is a whole range of demonstration projects. So how do we kind of test this and prove this up? And early years initiative being one of those. And then the other area which aligns to what Laurie was talking about to us today is really around building the awareness of the importance of those early years, brain development and neuroscience. So it's about, again, empowering parents, educators and carers with the knowledge of the importance of the early years and neuroscience, and creating the right environments for children to grow and thrive. So, and the TED talk was one element of that, and there's a couple of other products that sit under that. So they're kind of the two focus areas. One is actually mobilising and kind of empowering parents and educators to create the right environments, and then the other one is around the bigger picture systems change and testing that at a local level as well.
Thanks so much for joining us, Juan. The Early Years Initiative sounds like it's off and running. So congratulations on all the work that I know, all the hard work's gone into getting it to this point. So thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the next phase of the initiative.
Thank you. It was great to be here as well.
And it reminds me, Jay Weatherall was actually our first ever guest speaker on the first ChangeMakers in about May, and he was talking about more the throw by five, the advocacy agenda. So we've had a little bit of a look at that. Okay, we're out of time. Next month is our guest speaker will be Professor Glyn Davis, who's the CEO of the Paul Ramsey Foundation. So the biggest foundation currently in Australia. So I'm sure you'll all want to get up and close and personal with Glyn, who's just the loveliest man and has had a huge and stellar career in academia and the public service and now in philanthropy. So I know you'll want to join and meet and hear from Glyn about what the Paul Ramsey Foundation is doing. Please tell your friends. I'll tell all my friends in Queensland that they got the time wrong and then they did turn up an hour earlier. Michelle and I'll hang around and face a whole lot of disappointed Queenslanders in about 5 minutes. So yes, the next session's on second Tuesday of the month, 12:30 Sydney, Melbourne, Tasmania time. So that's Eastern Daylight Time, I think. So 12:30 on second Tuesday of the month, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. That's 11:30 in Queensland. I've got no idea what time it is in South Australia or WA, but some of you will know. Anyway, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next month.
Thanks, Matthew.